The gavel came down like a crack of thunder, a sound that would echo in his soul for decades. 60 years, the number hung in the cold, sterile air of the courtroom, a death sentence whispered in legal jargon. For Marcus Johnson, the world didn't go slow motion, it simply stopped. The breath froze in his lungs. The hopeful light in his mother's eyes, which had flickered defiantly until this very second, was extinguished completely, replaced by a void of pure despair. He was 22 years old. A college student with a future sketched out in textbooks and dreams. Now, those dreams were being replaced by a nightmare measured in concrete and steel, and endless cycles of counted steps and lost seasons. He looked at the judge, a man carved from marble and old money, his face an impassive mask of supposed impartiality. There was no flicker of doubt, no hint of humanity. Just the final, absolute power to erase a life. As the bailiff's hand clamped onto his shoulder, a single thought screamed in Marcus's mind, a silent protest against the crushing injustice: I didn't do this. But the system had spoken. The evidence, a flimsy house of cards built on a coerced testimony and a mistaken identity, was now law. His future, his name, his very existence, were being legally dismantled, but this is not where our story ends. This is where it begins. Because the tale of Marcus Johnson and Judge Harold Whitmore is a story of two prisons. One made of iron bars, and one made of prejudice and pride. And the most shocking sentence was yet to be delivered. This is a story of a verdict that shattered two lives, and the terrifying, life-altering truth that, years later, would bring them crashing back together, forever changing the meaning of justice. 5 years before the gavel fell, Marcus Johnson's world was painted in vibrant hues of ambition and community. He lived with his mother and younger sister in a modest, but warm apartment in the heart of a neighborhood where everyone knew your name. His mother worked 2 jobs, her hands perpetually rough, her smile perpetually warm, her unwavering belief in education her greatest gift to her children. Marcus carried that gift like a sacred torch. He was a business major at the local community college, studying late into the night after his shift at a grocery store, his textbooks filled with notes written in the determined script of a young man climbing his way up. He was cautious, aware of the unspoken rules he had to live by. Keep your hands visible. Be polite to a fault. Never run in public. The talk his mother had given him and his sister was not about birds and bees, but about survival in a world that might see his tall, athletic frame as a threat before seeing the gentle soul behind it. The crime that would unravel his life was a brazen armed robbery at a high-end electronics store across town. It was swift, professional. The perpetrators, masked and gloved, were in and out in 3 minutes. A security guard was pistol-whipped, left with a concussion but no life-threatening injuries. The entire event was captured on a grainy, black-and-white security feed that showed little more than shadows moving with violent purpose. Marcus's nightmare began with a knock on the door. 2 detectives, their faces a blend of weariness and casual authority. They asked him to come down to the station to answer a few questions. He went willingly, naively believing that cooperation was his shield. He had an alibi. He'd been studying in the college library, a fact corroborated by time-stamped login records on the library computer and a few nodding acquaintances who'd seen him there. But the system had already begun its lazy, relentless turn. An overworked, ambitious prosecutor needed a win. A witness, shaken and confused, was shown a photo array. Marcus's photo was in it. He looks familiar, the witness said, a statement of uncertainty that the detective's report would later solidify until the witness identified the suspect. It was enough. His alibi was dismissed as something he could have arranged with friends. His lack of a prior record was seen not as proof of character, but as luck that had finally run out. The subtle hints of discrimination were in the details, the tiny paper cuts that led to a fatal wound. The way the prosecutor emphasized his size, a big, powerful man who could easily intimidate a victim. The way his public defender, drowning in cases, encouraged him to take a plea deal for 10 years. It's a good deal, the lawyer said, not meeting his eyes. You risk much worse if this goes to trial. But Marcus refused. He was innocent. He believed the truth would shine through. He didn't yet understand that the truth was often the first casualty in a war of convenience and perception. He was being swept into a current he couldn't fight, a current fueled by the quiet, systemic desire for closure, for a neat and tidy resolution. Even if the wrong man had to be placed inside the box, the trial was a theater of the absurd, and Marcus was the star player who didn't know his lines. He sat at the defense table, wearing a suit that felt like a costume, watching as his life was methodically framed into a narrative he didn't recognize. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of implication. They presented the grainy video, pointing to a figure whose height and build matched the defendant. They never mentioned that hundreds of other men in the city shared that same build. The hesitant witness identification was presented as ironclad fact, the initial uncertainty carefully omitted. Marcus's alibi was picked apart. The friends who vouched for him were portrayed as unreliable, simply because they were from his neighborhood. The library timestamp was suggested to be a ruse, a clever trick. His public defender, a man named Mr. Evans, went through the motions. He cross-examined without passion, objected without conviction. He was a man playing a game he knew was rigged, already thinking about the next case on his docket. He failed to highlight the glaring lack of physical evidence: no gun, no fingerprints, no DNA, no stolen goods ever found in Marcus's possession. The case was a ghost, a story told with confidence enough to become real, and presiding over it all was Judge Harold Whitmore. To Marcus, he seemed less like a man and more like a monument to the law. He was in his late 50s, with a full head of silver hair and a reputation for being tough, but fair. Fair, the word tasted like ash. From his high bench, Whitmore viewed the proceedings with an air of detached boredom. He sustained the prosecution's theatrical objections and overruled Mr. Evans's meek ones. His interactions were always with the lawyers, never really looking at Marcus, the human being at the center of the storm. Marcus was a case file, a docket number, a problem to be processed. The verdict was guilty. The word hit his mother first. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, a sound of such profound agony that it finally made Judge Whitmore look down from his bench. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met Marcus's. And in that moment, Marcus saw it, not malice, but something perhaps more terrifying: absolute, unshakable certainty. The judge believed he was guilty. The system had spoken, and the judge, its high priest, had no reason to doubt its divine verdict. Then came the sentencing hearing. The prosecutor, seeking a headline, argued for the maximum, life, painting Marcus as a menace to society. His mother took the stand. Her voice trembled as she spoke of her son's character, his dreams, his kindness. She begged the court for mercy. Judge Whitmore listened, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood. He looked directly at the judge, his voice clear and steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Your Honor," he said, "I did not commit this crime. I am innocent. I don't ask for mercy. I asked for justice." Judge Whitmore peered down at him, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak. He talked about the severity of the crime, the trauma inflicted on the victim, the need to send a message to the community. He cited the law, the statutes, the procedures that had been followed. He talked about everything except the humanity of the young man standing before him. The court sentences you to 60 years in the state penitentiary, without the possibility of parole until you have served a minimum of 45 years. The gavel fell. The world ended. The transition to prison was a descent into a different world, a brutal, colorless ecosystem governed by violence and survival. The first years were a blur of fear, loneliness, and a rage so deep it felt like a physical presence inside him. He learned to keep his head down, to speak only when spoken to hide the intelligence that marked him as a target. He worked in the laundry, breathing in the stifling, chemical-scented air, his mind replaying the trial over and over, searching for the moment it all went wrong. The injustice wasn't a single event, it was a daily, grinding reality. It was in the condescending tone of a corrections officer, in the way his legitimate requests were ignored, and the system's utter indifference to his continued claims of innocence. He watched men break, their spirits crushed by the relentless weight of time. He vowed he would not be one of them. His innocence became his armor, his mantra. He buried his rage in books from the prison library, studying the law, writing endless letters to innocence projects, to lawyers, to anyone who would listen. Every returned, ignored letter was another small death, but he persisted. He had nothing but time, and a truth that refused to die. 22 years. Marcus Johnson was now 44 years old. The youthful hope had been etched away, replaced by a weathered resilience. He had become a jailhouse lawyer, respected by inmates and watched warily by guards. He had long ago given up on the system that had caged him, but he continued his work for others, fighting small battles within the war he had lost. One afternoon, he was called to the warden's office. This was unusual. He was handed a phone. A young, eager voice on the other end introduced herself as Anya Sharma, a law student with the Innocence Justice Initiative. They had taken on his case pro bono as part of an old evidence review project. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement, "we found something. The original evidence box from your case. It was misfiled, lost for years." Marcus's heart, which had learned to beat a steady, cautious rhythm, began to hammer against his ribs. And the robbery happened at a store with a sophisticated security system, right? One that had a silent alarm that triggered a secondary, high-resolution camera in the ceiling. The prosecution never entered that footage into evidence. It was listed in the initial police report but was lost before trial. We subpoenaed the original files from the company's defunct archives. "Mr. Johnson, we have the tape." He couldn't breathe. "What does it show?" "It shows the whole thing. Clear as day. Two men. Their faces are completely visible. It's not you, Mr. Johnson. It was never you." The world tilted on its axis. 22 years. The news didn't bring joy. It unleashed a tsunami of every suppressed emotion, grief, rage, vindication, and a profound, disorienting sense of loss for the man he could have been. The legal machinery, once so swift to condemn him, now moved with agonizing slowness to free him. The new evidence was incontrovertible. The true perpetrators, who had gone on to commit other crimes, were identified and arrested. They confessed to the robbery, expressing bafflement that someone else had been convicted for it. The media circus that followed was overwhelming. Marcus Johnson, the forgotten man, was now a symbol of a broken system. Reporters clamored for his story. Cameras flashed. And through it all, one question burned in his mind: what about the judge? Judge Harold Whitmore, now retired for 5 years, watched the news from his comfortable study in his suburban home. He saw Marcus's face on the screen, saw the headline "Innocent Man Freed After 22 Years." He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He remembered the case. Vaguely at first, then with horrifying clarity. He remembered the young, well-spoken defendant. He remembered the mother's cry. He remembered his own absolute certainty. He had been so sure. The system had been so assured. He had prided himself on his judgment, on his ability to read people, to discern the truth. That certainty was the foundation of his career, his identity. Now, it crumbled into dust, revealing a horrifying truth. He had been a cog in a machine that had devoured an innocent man's life. He hadn't been evil, he had been complacent. He had trusted a flawed process and, in doing so, had committed a monstrous error. The state launched an inquiry. Judge Whitmore was called to testify. He sat in the same courtroom where he had once held power, now just an old man in a suit, facing a panel of his former peers. He was asked how such a travesty could have occurred. He had no answers. He could only offer hollow platitudes about the fallibility of eyewitness testimony, but it was what happened after the hearing that would define the rest of his life. As he walked out of the courthouse, a throng of reporters surrounded him, shouting questions. And then, he saw him. Marcus Johnson. Standing silently off to the side, watching. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway. The convicted and the convictor. The judge and the judge. Whitmore froze. The noise of the crowd faded into a dull roar. All he could see was the face of the man whose life he had stolen. There was no anger in Marcus's eyes. No triumph. Just a deep, bottomless sorrow, and a quiet, unnerving strength that seemed to see right through him, unable to help himself, compelled by a force he didn't understand. Judge Whitmore broke away from the reporters and walked toward Marcus. The cameras followed, a silent, eager audience. He stopped a few feet away. The two men stood in silence, a chasm of 22 years between them. "Mr. Johnson," Whitmore began, his voice hoarse, unfamiliar. I don't know what to say. I can only apologize. I was wrong. The system was wrong." Marcus said nothing. He just continued to look at him, his gaze unwavering, absorbing the apology that was 2 decades too late and a lifetime too short. Whitmore's composure broke. The facade of the distinguished judge completely collapsed. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears he couldn't suppress. "I am so terribly, terribly sorry." He stood there, in that public hallway, a broken man finally facing the devastating cost of his certainty. The camera shutters clicked, capturing the moment the powerful judge wept before the man he had wronged. Marcus Johnson did not accept Harold Whitmore's apology that day. He simply nodded, a quiet, unreadable acknowledgement, and turned away. An apology could not give him back his 20s or his 30s. It could not restore the years he lost with his mother, who had passed away from a broken heart just a decade into his sentence, never having stopped fighting for him. It could not erase the nightmares, the institutionalized habits, the deep-seated knowledge of how fragile freedom truly is. The state offered him monetary compensation for his wrongful imprisonment, a sum of money that was supposed to equate to lost time. It was a fortune, and it was nothing. He used it to buy a small, quiet house and to fully fund the education of his sister's children, ensuring the dream he couldn't fulfill would live on in them. He dedicated the rest to the Innocence Justice Initiative, becoming a quiet, powerful advocate for the wrongfully convicted. He found a purpose, not in forgetting his pain, but in using it as a shield for others. But the story did not end there. For Judge Harold Whitmore, the public apology was not a catharsis, it was the beginning of a new sentence. His own. The image of him weeping was broadcast everywhere. He was vilified, a symbol of judicial failure. His friends and his privileged social circle quietly distanced themselves. His name, once respected, was now muddied. He lived in a prison of his own making, one of guilt, shame, and isolation. He could have retreated into bitterness, defended his record, blamed the police, the prosecutors, the system. But something in him had fundamentally shattered in that hallway. He began a painful, excruciating journey of introspection. He read every book on systemic racism, cognitive bias, and wrongful convictions he could find. He forced himself to re-examine his entire career, case by case, looking for the subtle signs of prejudice he had once been blind to: the quicker sentences for young black men, the higher bails set for defendants from poor neighborhoods, the unconscious trust he placed in the word of a police officer over that of a defendant. He saw, with horrifying clarity, that the case of Marcus Johnson wasn't an anomaly, it was the logical, extreme conclusion of 1,000 tiny biases he had carried his entire life. He had not considered himself a racist, and that was the problem. He had never had to. The system worked for him, so he assumed it worked for everyone. One day, a letter arrived at Marcus's foundation. It was from Harold Whitmore. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a 10-page, meticulously detailed account of his own journey of realization. He didn't make excuses. He laid bare his own failings, his complacency, his privileged blindness. He outlined his self-education, the books he'd read, the lectures he'd attended. He ended the letter not with an apology, but with a question: what can I do? Intrigued, and perhaps sensing a genuine transformation, Marcus agreed to meet him. They met in a neutral, public park. It was awkward and heavy with the weight of history. "The money is gone. My reputation is gone," Whitmore said, his voice old and tired. "But that is not my punishment. My punishment is knowing. It is waking up every single day and knowing what I did. I can't give you your time back. But I have time left. Tell me how to use it." Marcus looked at this broken, earnest old man. He saw the same certainty that had once condemned him now turned inward, a ruthless instrument of self-judgment. And in that moment, Marcus realized a profound truth: he was free in a way Whitmore was not. Marcus's innocence had been his salvation, a core of truth that the system could not corrupt. Whitmore's entire identity had been corrupted by his own hand. The system isn't broken, Marcus said quietly. It was built this way. It was built to be blind to some and hypervigilant against others. Your job isn't to apologize to me anymore. Your job is to go into every courtroom, every law school, every judges' conference you can, and tell them our story. Tell them to question their certainty. Tell them to look for their own blind spots. Tell them that the most dangerous thing a judge can be is sure, and so, an unlikely partnership was formed. Not of friendship, but of shared purpose. Harold Whitmore, the disgraced former judge, became a relentless campaigner for judicial reform. He traveled the country, standing beside exonerees, telling his story with brutal, uncomfortable honesty. He became a living cautionary tale, forcing his former colleagues to look in the mirror. He didn't do it for redemption. He knew that was impossible. He did it because it was the only useful thing left for him to do. Marcus Johnson watched this from a distance. He never became friends with Whitmore. Some wounds are too deep for that. But he found a measure of peace he hadn't expected. He had not only regained his freedom, he had, in a strange and painful way, held a mirror up to power and forced it to see its own reflection. He had transformed his pain into a catalyst for change, and in doing so, had found a power far greater than any judge's gavel. The story of Marcus and Harold is a story of two sentences. One, a verdict of 60 years, was meant to end a life. The other, a question, what can I do? Was meant to begin a new one. One was delivered from a bench of power, the other from a park bench of humility. One sought to punish without truth, the other sought truth as its only form of punishment. So, which holds more power? The sentence that seeks to cage the body? Or the truth that has the power to liberate a soul, and perhaps, if we are brave enough to face it, to change an entire system built on the shifting sand of certainty?